Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history. In our previous lectures, we talked about culture during the war years, and particularly how culture was used as a vehicle for improving national consensus and patriotism as we fought the various enemies during World War II. In these lectures, we'll turn to culture in the post-war years and heading into the 1950s. And we'll see in many ways that this idea of a culture of consensus carried over into the years after World War II. The idea of political consensus strengthened during the Cold War years as the United States felt compelled to present a united front against communism. This is one of the major themes we'll be talking about in terms of culture in the post-war years and the early 50s. There were also many demographic changes during this period. For one, the so-called Great Migration continued of blacks leaving the South and heading to the North, and from the countryside into the cities. In the post-war years, this was accompanied by a movement of whites out of the urban centers and into the suburbs, and the growth of suburbs becomes one of the significant cultural developments of this era. This is also the age of the so-called baby boom generation. Children were born at a much higher rate for a variety of reasons. The most superficial, perhaps, but certainly a factor, was the simple reunion that occurred between soldiers who had gone abroad to fight in the war and then returned home to their spouses in the aftermath of war. There was also the increase in home ownership and in general the economic prosperity and comfort of the years after the war and into the 1950s. By 1957, there was one baby born every 7 seconds in the United States. The baby boom generation carried with it a variety of cultural influences. There was a boom, for instance, in child and baby products and toys in the late 40s and into the 50s. Advertisements and popular culture reinforced images of safe, quiet suburbs, in contrast to the increasingly disorderly and dangerous inner cities. And in fact, there was growing uneasiness about the growing black presence in inner cities. White America constructed for itself a new, safe reality in the suburbs, surrounding themselves with such pleasant side amusements as shopping malls and amusement parks. The shifting demographics were reflected in professional sports as well, where several teams relocated from the Northeast, mostly to the West and in some cases to the South, tapping into new growing markets. In the 1950s, the Boston Braves moved to Milwaukee, the Philadelphia Athletics to Kansas City, the New York Giants to San Francisco, and most famously, the Brooklyn Dodgers moved to Los Angeles. In 1953, the Braves drew more fans in their first 9 games in Milwaukee than in the entire previous season. So these moves were effective from the standpoint of raising money for the teams. Race was a factor as well in some cases. As black neighborhoods surrounded Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, attendance declined. And eventually, owner Walter O'Malley moved the team to a suburban location in Los Angeles. The post-war era was filled with uncertainty and frightening issues, including race, sexuality, delinquency, and the fear of communism, permeated American culture. The growing Cold War panic spread in the United States, deepening by the late 1940s, and the 50s were suffused with Cold War fears. In August of 1949, the Soviets tested their atomic bomb, heightening these fears. And some Americans claimed that there were communists at work in the United States, trying to undermine the American way of life. One way to combat this trend was to affirm traditional views of American greatness and galvanize national pride. In the late 1940s and early 50s, as never before or since in American history, patriotism itself became a pastime. There were patriotic rallies, loyalty parades, and pageants, Know Your America weeks, and I Am an American days. We belonged to a free, classless, family-oriented society that sought agreement and compromise, not conflict. This is the image we projected, anyway. American entertainment tended to reinforce the traditional view of Americans as inclusionist, positive, and resourceful. Sports was another mechanism in this way. In a 1952 Olympic telethon, Bing Crosby laughed, "I think Joe Stalin thinks he's going to show up our soft capitalist Americans. We've got to cut him down to size." Sports became a symbol for America. In 1946, University of Oklahoma President George Cross hoped to restore the reputation of his university and his state through sport. At one meeting of the Board of Regents, he said, "There's only one way to get this state back on track, and that's football, football, football." This emphasis on football led to a string of successful seasons, including a record 47-game winning streak from 1953 until late 1957. College football in general came to represent a part of Americana, with its traditions, pageantry, and lore. In 1955, Life magazine wrote, "Football is everything America is: fast, young, colorful, complex, efficient, aggressive." In the post-war era, female cheerleaders came to have a central role in the visual imagery of football. As football historian Michael Oriard has written, "As outsiders, women played a key role in defining the center. The cheerleaders, majorettes, and adoring female fans enhanced the masculinity of football players by contrast." Football also reinforced the image of Americans as tough and resilient. Tough coaches like Paul Bear Bryant were celebrated as great molders of character and builders of young men. But it was professional football that really found a ready audience in the Cold War era. As Life magazine said in 1955, "Football is a man's game." Pro players could be hard-drinking roughnecks. They could get in a cheap shot under the pile. It was a working-class game, played in working-class cities. According to one description, this version of the game emerged on the soggy, snowbound fields of America's heavy industrial belt. In gritty contests, pro football players were mud, rain, frost, and wind boys, playing out a grunt-like drama on a muddy swath of land under the frosted skies of smokestack America. Football also played well on television and benefited from the rise of that medium. The ball was large enough and the action slow enough that the camera could follow reasonably well. In other sports, early grainy black and white television struggled to keep up with a small or fast-moving ball. The multi-ethnic nature of the sports world also meshed well with Cold War imagery. Sports in the United States were growing increasingly egalitarian, as immigrants and minorities were becoming more and more prominent on rosters at every level. In 1950, the all-white University of Kentucky team traveled to Madison Square Garden to play the team from the City College of New York, whose roster was filled with immigrants and black players. The coach of the University of Kentucky was Adolph Rupp, one of the great college coaches of all time. Rupp said that a black player would never play for his team. When the Kentucky players refused to shake the hand of one of the CCNY black players before the game, their coach used it as motivation to lead the team to a stunning upset. And yet, in the post-war years, the color barrier was coming down in many professional sports. In 1946, the Washington Redskins football team signed Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. In Cleveland, Bill Willis and Marion Motley, who's pictured there at the top on the right, helped to integrate the sport. Motley recalled, "Opposing players found out that while they were calling us names, I was running by 'em and Willis was knocking the shit out of 'em. So they stopped calling us names and started trying to catch up with us." For several years, Southern teams refused to play against teams with black players. But as the 50s went on, such efforts seemed more and more ridiculous, and teams declining to field black players found it more difficult to keep winning. In 1950, Althea Gibson broke the color barrier in tennis, playing in the United States Lawn Tennis Association. Gibson became one of the celebrated black athletes of the 50s. She won Wimbledon in 1957 and was honored with a ticker tape parade in New York City. Gibson was also a useful symbol of racial equality in the Cold War years. In 1955, she was sent on an extended State Department tour, playing against various international players. And of course, the most famous example was Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947 when he took the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers. By the end of that year, Robinson finished second as America's most admired man, behind only Bing Crosby. In the years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, it became commonplace for black athletes to break racial barriers on other teams and in other sports. There was little fanfare by 1950 when the Boston Celtics became the first team in the NBA to sign a black player. This went well with the image of the United States as a colorblind meritocracy, in which the most talented and deserving players will get an opportunity, regardless of color. And yet the reality persisted for many years after those initial barriers were broken, that most teams fielded only one or two black players, and many of those players found themselves winding up on the bench and suffering all manner of degrees of unpleasantness from fans, coaches, other players, and even sometimes players on their own teams. In the next lecture, we'll continue discussing the idea of American popular culture and the culture of consensus in the Cold War years, focusing on film and some other media.